Welcome back to the deep dive. We look at a lot of books on this show.
We really do.
Yeah, some are history, some are economics, self-help. But every once in a while, we get a text that feels less like a regular book and more like a weapon.
That's exactly the right word for it.
And today we're looking at something that is incredibly dense, highly controversial, and it describes itself as a logical fortress.
Right. Today we are unpacking Feminist Aggression, Family Court Atrocity Machine, Abortion Mills, and Extinction of Civilization by Conrad Riker.
It is a massive title.
A massive title for a massive book. And I have to say, right off the bat, if you're listening to this and you feel like the modern world has just gone crazy or that the deck is stacked against men in a way you can't quite articulate, the author positions this as the manual you've been waiting for.
Yeah, and before we even get into the machinery of it, I want to be really clear about the audience here. This is written specifically for the manosphere,
Very specifically.
for men's rights activists, and for guys who have taken the red pill. Riker he's not trying to be polite here. He's trying to hand you what he calls intellectual ammunition.
Exactly. And because this book is so ultra long and so incisive, we are talking about a complete dismantling of Western institutions here. We can really only give you the reconnaissance mission today.
Right, just the surface.
Yeah, so if you want the full arsenal, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and buy the ebook. Seriously, pause the show, go buy it right now, and come back. You're going to want to highlight this thing.
And while you're doing that, make sure you like and subscribe to the show. We are taking some risks covering this kind of material, and we really need your support to keep the algorithm happy.
Definitely.
Also, Conrad Riker is writing about this stuff in real time, so you need to follow him on Substack. That's at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
So let's get into this fortress.
Yeah, the premise here is terrifyingly simple. Riker argues that the institutions we trust, so the courts, the schools, the financial systems, they didn't just drift to the left.
No, he argues they were captured.
Captured, right.
He says they've been taken over by feminist and Marxist ideologies with one very specific goal, and that is to extract wealth and authority from men.
He literally calls it a wealth extraction apparatus. And what's interesting is how he builds this argument. He uses what he calls Aristotelian methods to prove it.
Right, he's not interested in feelings at all.
Yeah.
He is purely interested in logic. He wants to show that if A implies B and B implies C, then we are basically living in a system designed to destroy its own builders.
Okay, so let's start with the system he says breaks the most men, the family court.
Oh, man.
Yeah, Riker has a very specific name for this one,
The atrocity machine.
the atrocity machine.
Right.
But he doesn't just throw names around. He actually breaks down the business model of it. And this was the part that actually made my jaw drop. He argues that family court isn't about justice. He says it's a cartel.
It's a cartel because there is a built-in profit motive. To understand this, Riker takes us deep into Title IVD of the Social Security Act. Because most people think child support is just a private matter between two parents, right?
Yeah,
Managed by the state.
true. That's what we're all taught.
But Riker points out that the federal government actually pays the states incentive payments for every single dollar of child support they collect.
Wait, let's slow down and really unpack that mechanic for the listener. You're saying the state government gets a literal kickback from the feds based on the sheer volume of money they force men to pay.
Exactly. It is a volume business. Riker cites data showing that states get reimbursed for roughly 66% of their administrative enforcement costs.
Wow.
So the state isn't a neutral referee here. The state is operating like a bounty hunter. The more child support they order, the more federal funding flows into the state budget to pay for the bureaucrats, the judges, the clerks.
So if I'm a state administrator, I actually have a perverse incentive to make sure families are split up.
Yes.
Because if mom and dad stay married and just share a bank account, I can't collect child support, and my department doesn't get that federal bonus.
That is the big red pill realization of this chapter. Riker argues the system is explicitly designed to fracture families because intact families are bad for the state's bottom line.
They generate no revenue.
Right. To maximize revenue, you have to create a payer and a payee. And he presents the statistics to back this up. Mothers get sole custody in about 85% of contested cases.
85%.
And fathers make up over 90% of the pairs.
So it's a highly targeted retrieval system. But then society gaslights us with the whole deadbeat dad myth. We're constantly told these incredibly strict laws are necessary because men are just abandoning their kids left and right.
And Riker absolutely tears that narrative apart. He argues that the deadbeat dad is basically a ghost story invented to justify the extraction process.
How so?
Well, he points to data showing that when fathers actually have access to their children, when they are treated as equal parents, they pay their support at extremely high rates.
I want to support their kids.
Exactly. The men who stop paying are the ones who have been completely stripped of access, stripped of their dignity, and are just being treated like an ATM.
He effectively says the system breaks a man on purpose and then blames him for being broken.
Precisely. If you erase a man from his family's life and the only time the state contacts him is to demand money under threat of a jail cell, eventually he collapses. Riker says this isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature.
And the weapon they use to start this whole process is what he calls the tactical nuke.
Right. Chapter title, The Gavel is a Gun.
Yeah, the ex parte restraining order. Explain this to the listener who hasn't had the misfortune of going through the grinder. How can a standard restraining order be a tactical nuke?
Because it completely bypasses due process. An ex parte hearing literally means one party.
Just one side.
Right. The woman can go to a judge without the man even being in the building or knowing about it and claim she feels afraid. And based on that claim alone, the judge can issue an order that evicts the man from his own home, bars him from seeing his children, and even strips him of his Second Amendment rights.
Instantly. Like without a trial or evidence.
Instantly. By the time he even gets a court date to defend himself, he is already functionally homeless and legally labeled as a threat. Riker argues this is the absolute kill shot in modern divorce strategy.
Because it sets the baseline for everything else.
Lawyers know this. They use it to gain immediate, massive leverage over custody and assets before the actual divorce case even officially starts.
But how do judges justify doing this? Don't they need actual evidence of physical abuse to take someone's home away?
This is where Riker connects the legal practice directly to the ideological capture we talked about earlier. He takes a really deep dive into the Duluth model.
I've heard this term thrown around, but I've never fully understood how it works on the ground level.
The Duluth model is the primary training framework for police and courts regarding domestic violence in the West. And it effectively trains law enforcement to view all domestic conflict through this Marxist lens of power and control.
All right.
It assumes, by default, that the male is the oppressor who is using patriarchal power to control the female victim.
So if the police show up to a house and both people are screaming at each other, or even if the man is the one who has scratches on him.
The training actually predisposes the cops to arrest the man anyway. It pre-convicts him based on his gender. Riker argues this completely removes objectivity from the law. It turns the justice system into an ideological enforcement arm. You aren't being judged on your actions, you are being judged on your identity as a male.
And this leads us to the much deeper, almost philosophical argument Riker makes in the book. He calls it epistemological warfare, which is a heavy term, but it really feels like the root of the whole problem.
It is the root. Epistemology is just the study of how we know what is true.
Right, how we define reality.
Exactly. Riker argues that Western civilization was built entirely on Aristotelian logic. Objective facts, evidence, A equals A. But he says this has been actively replaced by standpoint theory.
Standpoint theory.
Yeah.
This is the academic idea that your lived experience is what determines truth.
Exactly. In standpoint theory, a woman's subjective feeling of fear is treated as a legitimate form of knowledge. If she feels unsafe, that feeling is elevated to the exact same status as hard legal evidence.
Wow.
Riker argues this is catastrophic for any concept of justice because you cannot defend yourself against someone else's internal emotion. If feelings are facts, then the objective reality of whether you actually did anything wrong becomes totally irrelevant.
It's a complete shift from innocent until proven guilty to guilty because she feels afraid.
Yes, and that fundamental shift leads into the very contract of marriage itself. Riker calls modern marriage the contract of one.
The contract of one,
Yeah.
because of no-fault divorce.
He points out that marriage is basically the only legal contract in existence where one party can unilaterally break it for absolutely any reason. Boredom, finding themselves, meeting someone else on a girl's trip.
Anything at all.
And the state won't just allow it, the state will actually reward them for breaking the contract.
Rewarded with cash and prizes. Or, more specifically, alimony and assets.
Riker goes to the wall on this topic. He argues that permanent alimony is a direct violation of the 13th Amendment.
The 13th Amendment. The one that abolished slavery. That is a massive claim to make.
It is, but follow his logic here. The 13th Amendment prohibits involuntary servitude. If a man is ordered by a state court to go to work every day to pay a woman he is no longer married to, and if he refuses to work, he is thrown in a literal cage, what is that?
He has no choice.
Right, he has no choice. He is laboring for someone else's financial benefit under the direct threat of state violence.
And Riker uses the Dave Foley story to really drive this point home. That case study always haunts me.
It is the perfect, tragic example of the atrocity machine in action. Foley, the comedian, was ordered to pay child support and alimony based on his peak earnings when he had a massive hit TV show.
Right, he was making millions.
But when the show was canceled and his income plummeted to normal levels, he went back and asked the court to lower the payments because he physically didn't have the money. And the court refused. They imputed an income to him.
Let's define that. Imputed means the court just pretended he was still making money he wasn't actually making.
Correct. The judge basically said, you should be making this much because you're famous, so pay up.
Unbelievable.
He couldn't pay it, so he effectively had to flee legally. He couldn't even go back to his home country of Canada to see his kids because he would be arrested at the border for a debt he mathematically could not pay. Riker uses this to show that the system literally criminalizes a man's existence if he isn't acting as an active funnel for wealth.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major concept, the fiscal vampire. It's not just the family courts doing this. It's the entire macroeconomic system. Riker argues that the state itself is just a giant engine for wealth transfer.
This is what he calls the economics of misandry. We are constantly hearing about the gender pay gap in the media. Riker flips the script entirely and talks about the tax gap.
The tax gap.
He breaks down government data to show that men are the overwhelming net tax contributors in society. Men work longer hours, they take much more dangerous jobs, they earn more overall, and therefore they pay the vast majority of the tax revenue.
Paying for the roads, the military, the infrastructure, and women.
In Riker's analysis, women as a demographic are net tax consumers. They are the primary beneficiaries of the welfare state, health services, education grants, and government administration jobs. He argues that the entire modern tax code is essentially just a legal mechanism to forcibly take resources from men and redistribute them to women.
He calls it the hidden tax. But he points out there's a blood tax, too. This is where Riker talks about the glass cellar.
This is such a powerful image. Modern feminism is always focused on the glass ceiling, right? Asking why aren't there 50% female CEOs in the Fortune 500, Riker says, look down, look at the glass cellar.
The bottom of society.
He cites the statistic that men comprise 92% of all workplace fatalities.
92%.
Yeah.
These are the guys on the oil rigs, deep in the coal mines, hanging the high voltage lines in a storm.
The guys who literally keep the lights on and keep civilization from collapsing. Riker argues that our entire society is built entirely on male disposability. He contrasts this modern attitude with the Titanic.
Right, women and children first.
Historically, the social contract was, yes, men have the authority in society, but the trade-off is that men must also sacrifice their lives to protect women when the ship goes down.
And Riker's point is that the deal has been completely broken by one side.
He says, modern feminism wants the absolute authority of the ship's captain, but still demands their guaranteed spot on the lifeboat. It's total entitlement without any gratitude. We demand that men build and maintain the physical world, but we demonize them for the exact masculine traits required to build it.
That leads right into his section on the war on boys. Because if society hates the traits that build civilization, you have to crush those traits early on.
Riker calls this the chemical leash. He looks at the modern education system and argues it has become openly hostile to biological masculinity. Little boys are naturally fidgety, they are competitive, they are risk takers.
Right, you want to run around, wrestle, and crash things into other things.
Exactly. And schools now pathologize that normal behavior. Riker argues that the massive explosion of ADHD diagnoses is actually just a form of social control. We are medicating healthy boys, giving them amphetamines like Ritalin and Adderall to force them to sit completely still and behave exactly like girls.
It's chemical compliance.
He calls it re-education through chemistry.
And then, when they grow up, we tell them their natural instincts are toxic.
Riker absolutely hates the term toxic masculinity. He argues it is a deliberate slur used to shame the very traits, aggression, stoicism, extreme drive, that are fundamentally necessary for human survival. He says we are waging a psychological war on the builders of our own world.
It is a very grim picture he paints. But Riker doesn't stop at the legal or the economic levels. Towards the end of the book, he goes fully spiritual. He talks about the Moloch state.
This is where the book shifts gears into something almost metaphysical. It's fascinating. He looks at the abortion industry, what he calls the abortion industrial complex, and he sees something much darker than just a standard political wedge issue.
Right. He uses this term, the billion baby scoreboard.
Yes. He cites the estimated global abortion numbers over the last century and calls it a literal demographic suicide pact. And he compares it directly to the ancient Canaanite worship of Moloch.
Where people would sacrifice their own children in the fire for the promise of a good harvest or financial prosperity.
Exactly. Riker argues that feminism is, at its core, an occult rebellion against nature, or against logos.
So, in his view, modern society is sacrificing its own future, its literal children, on the altar of corporate careers and personal convenience.
That's his exact argument. He sees it as a spiritual war against life itself. He posits that a civilization that casually kills its offspring and actively demonizes its fathers has lost the mandate of heaven. It simply cannot survive the century.
This brings us to the big so what? Because usually a manifesto like this would end with a call to action, like go vote for this guy or write your local congressman, but Riker, he does not do that at all.
No, not even a little bit. Riker is what you would call an accelerationist. He firmly believes the atrocity machine is way too big and way too corrupt to ever be fixed from the inside.
The voting booth won't save you.
Right. He argues that the only way out is through. He predicts a total systemic collapse, or what he calls a singularity.
And he pins a lot of his hope on emerging technology to get us there. Specifically, one technology that sounds straight out of sci-fi: artificial wombs.
Ectogenesis. Riker dedicates a really fascinating section to this concept. He argues that women currently hold a reproductive monopoly over the human race. They entirely control access to the next generation. But if technology advances to the point where it allows men to have children via artificial wombs, that ancient monopoly is permanently broken.
It would allow men to reproduce without taking on the immense legal risks of marriage or entering the family court cartel.
It completely changes the leverage dynamic of the entire species. But since we aren't quite there yet technologically, Riker advocates for what he calls the ghost strategy in the meantime.
And this sounded a lot like MGTOW to me when I read it.
It is deeply aligned with MGTOW men going their own way. He advises men to essentially go ghost. Withdraw completely from the legal system. Do not marry, do not cohabitate, do not sign the contract of one under any circumstances.
And financially, how do you ghost the tax system?
You starve the beast. If the state is a parasite feeding on male wealth, he says the ultimate revolutionary act is to simply cut off the food supply. He talks about stepping down the corporate ladder, working in the gig economy to minimize taxable income, or using Bitcoin to hide your hard assets from the gynocentric state.
He talks about building a parallel polis, too.
Right. His message is, don't try to save the burning building. Let it burn, and just focus your energy on building a new fireproof structure next door. Male-centered institutions, courts of reputation, alternative economies, and media. He wants men to build a secure lifeboat while the main ship sinks.
It all leads to that final syllogism he poses at the very end of the book. It's basically a mathematical argument for inevitable collapse.
The syllogism is just brutal, undeniable logic based on his premises. A civilization requires builders, which are men, and a future, which are children. If you structurally demonize the builders and intentionally kill the future, the civilization mathematically ceases to exist. Therefore, the current Western system is dead man walking.
And Riker believes a golden age awaits on the other side of that collapse.
He does. But only for the men who are actually ready for it. For those who have read the history, understood the trap of the Matrix, and actively built their own logical fortress.
It is a stark, totally uncompromising vision. It is certainly not something you're ever going to hear on the nightly news or in a university classroom.
And that is exactly why Riker wrote it. He wants to shock the system. He wants to violently wake men up to the reality of the board they are currently playing on, whether they realize it or not.
Well, consider us shocked. And I really want to reiterate to the listener, we have barely scratched the surface here. We touched on his main structural points, but Riker goes incredibly deep into the history of Seneca Falls, the Marxist roots of the early feminist leaders, and the very specific case laws that trap men today.
Yeah, if you want to truly understand the machinery that Riker says is actively hunting you, you cannot just listen to this summary. You need the source material. You need the intellectual ammunition for yourself.
Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now. Buy Feminist Aggression, Family Court Atrocity Machine, Abortion Mills, and Extinction of Civilization. Read it. Highlight the data, understand the core argument he's making.
And make sure you follow the author. He is analyzing these cultural shifts in real time, and you do not want to miss his ongoing updates. Follow Conrad and Riker on Substack.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. It's a question that Riker's work forces you to ask, regardless of where you might stand on the political spectrum.
Let's hear it.
If Riker is right, and the entire Western system, this fiscal vampire, is completely dependent on male labor and male tax dollars to keep the lights on and the water running, what would happen if just 10% of men decided to go ghost tomorrow? Not a violent revelation, just a silent, collective withdrawal of their competence and their labor. Would the civilization even survive the winter?
That is the exact question the system is absolutely terrified to answer.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Make sure you like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you these forbidden red-pilled topics. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next one.